Have you ever seen someone smile while crushing another man's life to pieces? Ethan Cole stood frozen in the dust, staring at the wreckage of his garage, his late father's motorcycle shattered under twisted beams, while HOA President Karen Whitfield laughed into her phone like she had just won a war. How far would you go if someone erased everything you built? Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. This one is going to hit hard. If that just sent a chill down your spine, you're exactly where you need to be. This isn't just a story, it's a fight you'll feel in your chest. Tap like to stand with Ethan. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Ethan Cole stood so still it scared the people watching. The dust hadn't even settled over what used to be his garage. His father's motorcycle, the one they rebuilt together in the summer heat, lay crushed beneath broken boards and twisted nails. Karen Whitfield, her white suit practically glowing against the chaos, was barking into her phone, a smirk curling on her face like this was just another Tuesday victory. Every neighbor was there, standing just far enough back to stay out of it, whispering about guidelines and permits. Ethan didn't shout. He didn't even ask why. His silence was worse. Hours later, when the sun went down, Ethan walked straight into the HOA meeting hall. Conversations died instantly. Noah Reyes, the youngest on the board, stiffened in his chair. Shelley Park, the treasurer, couldn't look him in the eye. Karen sat at the head table like a queen guarding her throne, brushing imaginary dust from her sleeve. Ethan stood in the center, jaw tight, letting the tension stretch until every eye was on him. He said one thing, cold and even, a promise that landed like a hammer. Before the sun sets tomorrow, every person in that room would regret what they did today. No one moved. Karen tried to laugh, but the sound cracked. Grant Whitfield, her husband and the city inspector who signed off on the demolition, sent Ethan a text mid-meeting, a code citation for unpermitted structure, as if paperwork could still scare him. Ethan looked at the screen, let the faintest smile touch his face, and put the phone away. He didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't beg. He left the hall as quietly as he entered. The next morning, the banner outside read HOA meeting today, like it was taunting him. Karen's SUV gleamed in front of the hall. She stepped out, clipboard under one arm, ready to dictate another day of power plays. Then the sound started. A low, mechanical growl that shook the air. Ethan was there, climbing into the cab of a bulldozer, face set, hands steady. Karen shouted across the lot, voice sharp, ordering him to stop. She fumbled with her phone, calling Officer Dana Morales to report him before he even moved. Ethan didn't look at her. He gripped the lever, and the engine roared louder. The crowd started gathering fast. Some shouted at him to get down. Others cheered under their breath. The blade lowered until it kissed the hall's corner, leaving a scar that made everyone hold their breath. Then Ethan did something no one expected. He stopped. He climbed down slowly, dust covering his shirt. Karen marched toward him, heels stabbing the ground, and jabbed her finger at him, threatening fines, prison time, lawsuits. Ethan didn't speak. Silence was his weapon now. Noah stepped forward, shaking slightly, and said he had proof, real proof, that what Karen did was illegal and that she had been siphoning HOA funds for months. He told Ethan that if he leveled the building now, they'd never get justice, only chaos. Karen snapped at Noah, called him a liar, accused him of betrayal, but her voice was breaking. Before anyone could move, sirens wailed in the distance. Karen's face brightened with triumph. She turned to the crowd and shouted that the police were coming for Ethan. Two cruisers skidded to a stop, but instead of arresting him, the officers walked right past Ethan and headed straight for Karen's SUV. Karen's smirk faltered. Officer Morales asked for her keys. Karen demanded to know why, voice shrill now, but the officer repeated the order and reached for an evidence bag. Karen froze, phone shaking in her hand. The neighbors were dead silent, watching. Ethan stood with his arms crossed, face calm, as if this was exactly what he expected. The sound of the officer unlocking the glove box felt louder than the sirens. What was inside that SUV that could make Karen's face turn from rage to panic in a single heartbeat? Officer Dana Morales slid on gloves and reached into Karen Whitfield's SUV while the entire street held its breath, and the first thing she lifted was an association debit card that shouldn't have existed in a president's glove box, wasn't it? A second card followed, then a paper stack bound by a rubber band. each receipt whispering a name that didn't belong to community repairs, and Noah Reyes began calling vendors from memory, like a metronome counting down the end of a reign. How many tiny cuts can a neighborhood take before it bleeds? Karen tried to steady her voice, called it clerical error, then sabotage, then jealous staff. But her hands told a truer story as they trembled against that immaculate white sleeve, and Ethan Cole did not move, because silence can be louder than sirens when it belongs to someone who has already lost everything. Isn't that the kind of quiet that makes masks slip? Morales lifted an envelope tucked under the manual and fanned out authorization signatures that looked familiar until you looked twice. Mismatched curls, rushed initials, dates that kissed each other too closely, and Lila Nguyen stepped forward to say she had asked for these forms for months and was told to stop causing trouble. What happens when the teacher finally stops asking nicely? Marcus Reed raised his late fee notices, 3 in a row for a fence height that matches the treasurer's, and his laugh carried no humor when he added that the playground still sits broken while Karen's porch got a new camera on the association's dime. Who believed safety was the story when comfort kept showing up at the same address? Grant Whitfield shouldered through the crowd with a clipboard like a badge and announced Ethan's home condemned effective immediately. But Noah asked which engineer declared imminent hazard, and Grant's answer arrived as silence wrapped in bravado. How long can borrowed authority pretend it owns the room? Grant tried a photo on his phone to prove cracking at Ethan's foundation, and Noah asked for the timestamp, which revealed last week across town under a different porch light, and the smothered gasp from the board's table sounded like loyalty recalculating its odds. Isn't that the second when paper knives turn on the hands gripping them? A private security truck rolled in on Karen's call, uniforms crisp and boots quick, but Captain Sergio Alvarez listened as Noah requested a work order and proof of payment and found both missing. Last invoice unpaid, contract inactive, and Sergio turned to Officer Morales and declared his team neutral witnesses, not weapons. How quickly does a rented wall become a mirror? Shelley Park's eyes glistened as she slipped her treasurer badge into her pocket and whispered that emails about irregularities went unanswered, and Tom Briggs, the veteran with the steadiness of steel, said he'd offered to repair the park for free and was fined for volunteer labor. What name do you give to rules that punish help and reward extraction? Morales radioed financial crimes to log the cards, the envelope, the fake friendly signatures, and Karen lunged toward Noah with a hissed accusation, but Ethan stepped between without touching either of them, a line drawn by presence alone, and the crowd inhaled as if oxygen could choose a side. Can a street decide in one breath who it wants to be? Noah swallowed hard, then said the quiet thing out loud. The siphon didn't start with Karen and won't end with her, because the transfer's route through a shell owned by developer Victor Hale, the man who buys quiet neighborhoods by turning them into problems first. How many evictions were the costume of progress before people tear off the mask? Karen spat that Noah was lying and that he always wanted her chair, and Noah's answer came as data, a live dashboard on his phone showing funds landing at a luxury rental tied to Karen's name, with a vendor description labeled equipment storage. And the laughter that rippled then wasn't joy. It was recognition that a fairy tale had ended. When fictions fail, do they fail all at once? Grant reached for the phone, and Morales caught his wrist with the softest grip that still said no. Then she nodded to an officer who began bagging items from the glove box, while another photographed the dashboard log. And Ethan finally spoke, just enough to say that saints do not bulldoze garages. Who can argue when the wreckage still smells like yesterday? Shelley looked at Karen and asked where the emergency notice had been mailed, because Ethan never got it. And Karen said process had been followed to the letter, while her eyes slid off every face that wasn't hers. And Marcus muttered that letters don't whisper, bullies do. How long did fear collect dues before courage set up a table of its own? A small boy tugged Marcus's sleeve and asked whether the swings would be fixed now, and Marcus smiled with the ache only parents know when promising a better road. And Lila promised her students would hear what adults did when rules were used like fists. Does change begin when future witnesses are invited to the front row? Morales announced impoundment of Karen's SUV for forensic accounting, and the last of Karen's composure fluttered like a ribbon losing its knot. And in that exact moment, engines deeper than police rolled from the far end of the block, black SUVs gliding with the confidence of people who think streets are investments, not homes, who arrives without being invited and expects applause. The convoy doors opened and Victor Hale stepped out with a folder and a practiced smile that buys cities, his gaze sliding over receipts and tiers as if they were the same line item. And he told the officers to stand down on behalf of stakeholders while his aide unfolded a letterhead that liked itself too much. What signature believes it can outvote an entire neighborhood? Officer Morales asked for lawful authority, and Victor offered a speech about interim approvals and emergency coordination while Noah scanned the page and tapped a date that didn't exist on any meeting minutes. And the air grew sharp with the sound of a bluff meeting daylight. When power forgets paperwork, does it expect fear to fill the gap? Ethan did not bow to the new arrival. He simply stepped closer to Morales and asked her to compare Victor's letter with the audit trail on Noah's drive. And Sergio positioned his team as human notebooks, logging names, times, words, faces, a living archive in tactical boots. What happens when memory shows up wearing a uniform that won't lie? Victor pivoted, smiling, to Ethan, promising restitution for today's misunderstanding and a quick resolution if the bulldozer stayed put. But Ethan's eyes held the kind of grief that cannot be bribed, and he answered that some debts are measured in summers and fathers, not numbers. How do you pay a bill that time already stamped paid in pain? Phones lifted as if pulled by gravity while neighbors moved closer to each other instead of back, and Morales lifted the impound slip with a calm that said the ground had changed. Then financial crimes crackled in her ear, and she nodded once like a gavel nobody could see. When the quiet people in headsets speak, who stops the echo? Victor angled toward Grant for a quick low-tone exchange that ended with Grant's face going pale, clipboard sagging as if it remembered it was just paper, and Shelley's shoulders squared with the relief of someone done being afraid of her own signature. Isn't liberation the moment your name stops serving someone else's story? Noah slipped a second drive from his pocket, labeled HailNet, and placed it in Morales' hand like lighting a fuse he had triple-checked, and the neighbors leaned forward as if pulled by a magnet of truth, because they knew this street could not go back to sleep after today. Once your eyes adjust to daylight, who wants the dark? Victor signaled with 2 fingers and more suits stepped to the curb, but so did Marcus and Tom and Lila and Sergio's team. A line that looked like ordinary people but sounded like a verdict, and Ethan climbed onto the bulldozer again, resting one hand on the key without turning it. A promise more than a threat. What breaks first when immovable meets unstoppable and both know what they're fighting for? Morales raised her palm and told everyone to hold, then turned the second drive so her body camera could see the label. And as she called in the new chain of evidence, the convoy shifted like predators smelling rain, because storms change the hunt, don't they? Victor's smile returned, thinner now, and he said the word stakeholder again like it could hypnotize a city that had just woken up. But the only word that mattered was the one Morales spoke next as she pointed past Ethan and past Karen and straight at the man who thought he owned the morning. Because sometimes the street learns its own name and says it out loud. Are you ready to hear who stands accused when money runs out of places to hide? Officer Dana Morales said the name Victor Hale with the clean weight of a verdict, and the street answered with a hush that felt like a door locking, didn't it? Victor's smile barely moved as he lifted his polished folder toward her body camera. But inside the pages lived half-signed permits, a stamp from an office that doesn't exist, and a date that tripped over its own shadow. How much paperwork turns to dust when somebody actually reads it? Noah Reyes stepped beside Morales with the calm of a man who knows the fuse he lit is timed just right, and he scrolled a dashboard that mapped transfers from the HOA account to a rental in Victor's network, while Karen Whitfield, still in her white suit, whispered that this was all performance. Who believes the stage when the prop money matches the serial numbers? Shelley Park pressed a trembling thumb to a line item labeled equipment storage and said she'd never approved that vendor. And Tom Briggs grunted that he'd seen cleaner ledgers and field tents. And Marcus Reed raised his phone with 3 months of fines and no repaired swing. When does patience downgrade to witness? Victor shifted to charm, called it interim coordination and necessary agility. But Morales asked for statutory authority, and he handed her a letter with a signature that looked brave until Noah tapped the signatory's retirement notice. How does confidence walk when the floor learns your name? Grant Whitfield pushed forward with a safety citation for Ethan Cole's home, claiming imminent hazard, and Ethan simply asked who inspected and when, which turned Grant's mouth into a stalled engine, while Noah called out the photo's metadata from last week 3 neighborhoods over. What happens to a hammer when the nail moves out of reach? Sergio Alvarez lifted his notebook and repeated that his team was neutral witnesses only, then began logging names, times, and phrases with the patience of a ledger that plans to meet a courtroom. Who fears a camera when the truth is finally louder than the lens? Morales read the impound authorization for Karen's SUV, and the glove box gave up a second envelope, thicker than the first, full of approvals that sounded official until you counted the misspellings. And Karen snapped that a clerical assistant would be fired by morning. How many assistants does it take to carry one person's blame? Lila Nguyen spoke like a bell, reminding everyone she'd emailed for transparency since winter and received violations for being persistent, and the crowd murmured her name as if courage had a homeroom now. When teachers stop waiting, who rings the period bell? Victor tried the future pitch, whispering about amenities and rising values if people would let professionals clear obstacles, and Ethan answered with 6 steady words about fathers, summers, and a motorcycle under a pile of boards. Can a forecast outbid grief measured in oil-stained hands? A quiet neighbor stepped forward, card clipped to a lanyard no one had noticed before. Former city clerk Rosa Calderon. And she said the red tag template Morales held was retired after a scandal. The seal spacing was wrong. Which detail betrays a forgery first, the emblem or the ego? Morales radioed the records office, and the reply arrived like rain on a grass fire. The seal was inactive, the office name deprecated, the signature on medical leave since spring. How many lies can share one pen before the ink dries? Grant's shoulders sagged, and he tried to salvage dignity by invoking emergency discretion. But Shelley cut in that emergencies don't start at dawn the day after you bulldoze a memory. And the single father said that if emergencies could be scheduled, they'd already be sold out. When timelines wear suits, who sells the seats? Noah lifted a second flash drive labeled HailNet and placed it into Morales's palm like a relay baton. And she announced chain of custody, while Victor's aides pretended not to hear the click of inevitability. Does silence sweat when it realizes it's being recorded? Morales asked Victor again for lawful authority. He gestured to an overlay ordinance nobody here remembered receiving by mail, and Rose's eyebrows lifted as she cited the rule requiring certified notices to impacted owners, then asked for mailing logs. Who trusts a map that forgot the houses? The aide flipped pages and landed on a contractor whose name matched the vendor paying Karen's luxury rental, and the gasp that followed wasn't loud. It was focused, like a lens snapping to sharp. When every road leads to one door, what do you do with the key? Victor dropped politeness and raised pressure, hinted at restraining orders, fines, and the kind of litigation that drains savings through slow drips. But Ethan didn't blink, because people who watch their last irreplaceable thing crushed learn the difference between money and value. Can a threat reach someone who has already walked past the worst? Morales's radio crackled again. Financial Crimes requested Victor's folder and the second drive for expedited review. So she handed evidence sleeves to her partner and turned to the crowd, reminding everyone to stay calm while the law did its work. Since when did calm feel like momentum? Karen lunged for Noah's phone with a sudden burst of fury, and Sergio slid a boot half an inch, enough to block her without touching her. And Karen hissed about betrayal, while Shelley whispered that loyalty ends where theft begins. Whose side is a spine supposed to serve? Grant called to Victor for backup, and Victor called him dead weight, saying it loud enough for everyone to hear, and Grant flinched like he'd been dropped from a moving truck. How quickly do kings discard their heralds when the crowd stops bowing? Marcus lifted his daughter's broken swing chain and asked if the next budget would buy silence or playgrounds, and Lila said her students will grow up knowing how to identify fraud before it identifies them. What happens when a neighborhood learns to audit more than numbers? Noah's voice steadied as he explained the dotted lines. Shell companies buying arrears, fines weaponized to force sales, quiet purchases routed through committees that never met. And he ended by naming Victor's brother on the zoning board. One breath from the gavel. Who profits when rules learn to point like arrows? The crowd's hum turned to a chord. Even hesitation found harmony as people stepped closer, and Morales raised her hand once more to keep the street from tipping into chaos. Because a win without structure becomes tomorrow's loss. Isn't discipline the difference between justice and spectacle? Victor's smile returned just enough to be insulting as a courier jogged up with a crisp envelope for Morales, marked with a deputy's name no one recognized. Inside sat a demolition review for Ethan's home at 8 a.m., stamped as urgent in ink that wanted to be important. How does ink choose urgency over legitimacy? Ethan took the paper, read it, and folded it flat, eyes steady. And Noah leaned close to tell him the second drive had a timed upload if anything happened to him. Sometimes safety is a plan that assumes the storm will try again. What does courage look like when it stops being a moment and becomes maintenance? Morales dialed the duty judge while Rosa drafted a sworn statement on the spot, and Sergio posted his team as a witness line between contractors and front steps, and Tom called for a neighborhood watch schedule without asking permission. When a block remembers it's a unit, who can separate it by envelope? Victor signaled to his aide, and a row of assessors in hard hats drifted closer, pretending this was routine, and Lila lifted her phone and announced to the live stream that any crew crossing that curb without lawful clearance would be named on record. How many routines survive a camera that knows your face? The duty judge's answer came through the speaker, clipped and clear, demanding verification of the deputy and warning against any action before review. And the developers' suits shifted their weight the way chess pieces do when the board stops cooperating. What move remains when the clock belongs to someone else? Ethan stepped back to the bulldozer and rested the key on his palm, not as a threat, as punctuation, and the crowd's breath sank to the engine's quiet tick, because everyone understood the grammar of lines you don't cross twice. Is there a stronger sentence than the one a community writes together? Victor's phone vibrated, and he listened to a voice that changed the angle of his jaw. Then he smiled in a way that meant Plan B was meaner and faster, and he told his aide to prepare a sunrise assessment regardless of hearings. Who gambles on fatigue when a street has already chosen caffeine over fear? Morales handed the copied order back to Ethan and promised eyes on the block until morning, then looked straight at Victor and said any unauthorized crew would leave with case numbers instead of paychecks. And the officer's calm carried more gravity than the convoy's chrome. When badges bet on daylight, who bets on shadows? Karen, cuffed beside the impounded SUV, tried one last insult that landed with a dull thud, and Shelley, no longer treasurer but finally honest, answered that apologies belong to those who can't afford excuses. Can a fall rewrite a person or only reveal them? The street began assigning itself tasks. Phones traded, names logged, timelines built, and Ethan pressed the folded order into his black folder next to the photos of the motorcycle, stacking tomorrow's threat beside yesterday's loss until resolve felt like balance. What else can they take from someone who already chose what can't be bought? And just when the neighborhood looked ready to hold the night on its own, a new set of engines rolled in slow and confident, bearing a different city seal on their doors and a familiar arrogance in their mirrors, while Victor's smile returned as if he'd been waiting for this reinforcement all along. Who sent the next wave with clocks set to 8 a.m., and what happens if they try to cross a line that already has a name? The new convoy rolled in like a memory of old power, doors opening to reveal assessors with fresh badges and smiles trained to outlast arguments. And Victor Hale lifted his chin as if the street had just met the real schedule. Did anyone here still think this was a small fight? Officer Dana Morales read the decals, checked the names, and asked for deployment orders, and the lead assessor produced a packet stamped with an acting director no one recognized, while Rosa Calderon murmured that the title existed but the person did not. How many ghosts were hired to push living families out? Ethan Cole stood by the bulldozer with the key resting against his palm, and Marcus Reed counted faces while Tom Briggs assigned quiet posts at each driveway, and Lila Nguyen whispered into the live stream that any crew crossing without lawful clearance would meet a wall of witnesses. Can routine survive when the neighborhood starts acting like a record? Grant Whitfield tried to reattach himself to authority and walk toward the new team with that old clipboard, only for Victor to wave him away in front of everyone. Useless and over, and Grant froze like a man hearing his replacement announced on his own porch. How fast does a ladder vanish when the person at the top decides he never needed it? Noah Reyes met Morales halfway and opened the second flash drive index to folder 4, tracing payments from a holding company to the overlay vendor to a consultancy stamped with a Hale surname, each arrow a sentence that didn't require adjectives. When a diagram looks like a confession, who still asks for dialogue? Shelley Park finally lifted her head and said the board never approved an overlay notice, and if it had, she would remember signing fear into her neighbors' mailboxes, and a tired hush moved through the crowd that sounded like people forgiving themselves for not seeing sooner. What does relief feel like when it stops being guilty? Victor gestured to his aide, who began draping caution tape like garland, and Sergio Alvarez stepped in with a logbook and told them to hold until verification returned. Witnesses only, names on every inch of intent. Since when did a clipboard fear a pen? Morales's radio chirped with the duty judge again, a voice sharpened by coffee and principle, demanding confirmation of the acting director and reminding all parties that emergency powers cannot be used as shortcuts for convenience. Which word scares bullies more? No or record? Ethan walked toward Victor until only the key fit between them and asked if the offers would stop if the answers arrived. And Victor smiled a billionaire smile that never reaches his eyes and promised progress with the warmth of a winter lamp. Can light that cold warm anything you plan to demolish? Rosa added a sworn line about retired templates and incorrect seals, and the lead assessor twitched just enough to give himself away, then tried to change subjects with a safety speech no one ordered. Who believes lectures delivered from a moving target? A patrol car slid in with a plainclothes investigator, who took Noah's map and compared it to the folder Morales held, and his eyebrows did the kind of math that ends with handcuffs after lunch. What happens to a parade when the band starts playing Indictment? Victor pivoted to cost, hinted that Ethan's stunt would bankrupt the homes cheering for him, and Lila cut him with a teacher's smile by saying numbers only terrify those who don't show their homework, and the comments exploded as viewers posted hearts and case law in equal measure. Since when did civics class trend? Marcus lifted the broken swing chain again and asked if Victor planned to buy that silence too, and Tom promised to weld it back by tomorrow whether or not permission liked the sound, and Sergio offered to notarize every volunteer hour as a love letter to the block. What price defeats people who learn the value of each other? Morales raised a hand and said loud enough for every uniform to hear that site access was denied pending verification, and the lead assessor swallowed hard as two of his crew stepped back a half-inch, the length of doubt you can't rehearse away. Isn't hesitation the first crack in any plan? Victor's phone buzzed and he listened like a man checking the weather on a day he wished for rain. Then he nodded once and told his aide to proceed with protective fencing only, a sleight of hand attempt to plant Victory's roots while the judge blinked. Who confuses patience with permission? Ethan climbed onto the bulldozer and sat, not a threat so much as a fact, and the engine answered with a low promise that made every collarbone feel the rhythm, while Noah called out timestamps for the stream. 2 minutes. 1. Stay with us. Truth needs witnesses. How long can fear hold its breath when courage keeps exhaling? Karen Whitfield, cuffed but defiant, threw one last curse across the scene that died before it reached anyone, and Shelley replied that regret arrives late to those who overbooked denial, and Grant stared at the asphalt like it might write him an alibi. Who teaches a fall how to land with dignity? Morales stepped to Victor and asked again for proof of mailed notices. He nodded to his aide, who produced an affidavit from a contractor whose office address resolved to a mailbox at a shipping store, and the neighborhood laughed the soft laugh that means we are tired and we are done. What chance does fraud have against fatigue finally choosing purpose? The investigator's phone pinged, and he smiled the way men smile when patterns become charges, then whispered to Morales while she kept her gaze level, and Victor pretended not to notice the weather changing. How many umbrellas can money buy against a storm made of evidence? Ethan dipped the blade until it hovered over the scar he'd made earlier, that thin silver line between restraint and justice, and the block went quiet because everyone understood grammar when it wears steel. Does punctuation sometimes look like mercy before it looks like consequence? Victor lifted his hands for calm and offered a final compromise. Stand down now. Cash later. Respect tomorrow. And Rosa's eyebrow arched into a history book as she asked which tomorrow ever belonged to the people who met him today. Can a promise be currency if it never matures? Morales counted down in her mind the minutes until the judge's written order would land, and Sergio's team widened its witness line like a hug that refuses to be moved, and Noah squeezed Ethan's shoulder once, a silent yes to whatever came next. What friendship survives if it doesn't show up when metal meets memory? Victor's convoy edged forward on slow tires, fencing posts clinking like preparation whispering over principle, and Ethan closed his hand around the key, jaw set with the quiet of a man who rebuilt a motorcycle with a father who taught him that fixing and fighting both require steadiness. Can vengeance be precise enough to feel like repair? Morales shouted hold to both sides and locked eyes with Victor as her radio barked that the judge was signing, and Victor tilted his head, listening to a second call that stole the angle from his smile. And in that breath between old rules and new orders, Ethan raised the blade a hair. The street inhaled, the stream swelled, and Victor's aide broke formation to shove a brand new envelope into Morales's hand. An overnight demolition authorization stamped 8 a.m., a different signature, a different seal, and a clock already marching toward them. What breaks first when the ink insists on arriving before the law? Officer Dana Morales flipped the new envelope open and read the stamp aloud, while every heartbeat on the street tried to count faster than the clock, and Victor Hale watched her face like a gambler reading cards he thought he stacked. How many signatures does it take to fake inevitability? Ethan Cole took the paper from her, eyes steady, folded it once, then slid it into the black folder beside the photo of his father's motorcycle. And something in that simple motion told the block this wasn't a man who would be chased off by stationery. Can ink bully someone who already buried the worst day and kept standing? Victor offered mercy with a price tag, said stand down now, and we forget the blade against the hall, and Lila Nguyen answered that forgetting is what got them here. While Marcus Reed raised the broken swing chain like a receipt no ledger could erase. What numbers outvote a memory held by a whole street? Noah Reyes whispered that the timed upload was live. Folder for mapping money from HOA accounts to shells tied to Victor's brother on zoning. And Morales confirmed financial crimes was watching it populate in real time. When truth walks itself to the courthouse, who dares block the door? Victor shifted to ice, told Ethan the house would be dust by noon. Progress never pauses for sentiment, and Ethan's reply was a calm that carried teeth. Progress fixes before it destroys. Does a future built on fear ever make it past inspection? Sergio Alvarez planted his witness line between assessors and porches, names logged, badges noted, and Tom Briggs called out posts like he was back on a perimeter, while Shelley Park stood in front of the ruined hall signs and said the board she served died the moment it forgot who paid the dues. When service forgets people, is it anything but a pose? Morales's radio barked, the duty judge's order landed, and she read the words that matter out loud. Freeze on discretionary HOA actions. Halt on any demolition pending fraud review. And the cheer that answered wasn't wild. It was relief shaped like discipline. Can victory be quiet and still feel like thunder? Victor didn't blink. He signaled his aide. Assessors rolled fencing forward under the label of safety. Ethan climbed into the bulldozer and turned the key with a patience that rattled more nerves than rage. Blade hovering over the scar he had drawn at dawn. Where does restraint end and justice begin if not at the exact line liars crossed? Karen Whitfield, wrists cuffed beside the impounded SUV, tried to spit a curse that stumbled over her dry mouth. And Shelley told her the neighborhood would repair what she broke and remember what she taught them to watch for. Can infamy be useful if it turns into a lesson plan? Morales raised a flat palm. Stand by. She stepped between fencing and front yards, counted names for the report, then said 4 words that rearranged the air. Evidence team en route now. How fast does a scheme age when cameras start asking birthdays? Victor's smile thinned. Time had turned against him. Ethan looked at Noah, then at the hall, then at the people whose shoulders were touching for the first time in months, and he lowered the blade until it kissed the frame. The neighborhood's breath sinking to the engine's growl. What happens to a monument when the people it oppressed decide they're done being quiet? Steel bit wood. The wall screamed. Years of fines and threats and midnight letters folded into splinters. Phones shook in neighbors' hands as the hall exhaled its last. Ethan drove with the care of a craftsman removing rot, not a brute smashing brick, because this was surgery on a tumor that learned to call itself tradition. When a symbol finally falls, does the ground feel lighter? Dust rose, then settled into applause. Tom pumped a fist. Lila pressed both hands to her face and laughed through tears. Marcus lifted his kid so small eyes could see big courage. Sergio called out time, position, impact, testimony, a steady drumbeat for whatever judge would read this in ink. Do moments count more when someone counts them properly? Morales stepped forward as the last beam tipped and gave way. She turned to Karen and read out the stack of charges without venom. and Karen's shoulders wilted under a weight that once sat on everyone else's doorsteps. When a crown turns to cuffs, who fills the silence where orders used to be? Grant Whitfield tried to lunge back into authority on reflex. Morales didn't even touch him, just asked for the real location data on his photo, and he sagged like a stage prop, remembering it was cardboard. Can a clipboard apologize? Victor approached Ethan with a voice that sounded like velvet pulled over a blade, promising injunctions, liens, and a calendar of hearings designed to starve patience, and Ethan didn't answer him at all. He looked at Rosa Calderon and asked her to notarize witness statements, because the best reply to a threat is a process that doesn't blink. Isn't paperwork beautiful when it finally serves the right side? The investigator arrived, took Noah's map, compared it to Victor's folder, nodded without smiling, and requested server images from the aide. Two suits hesitated, then handed over drives like people who realize the ocean will not negotiate with a teacup. How many files does it take to sink a yacht? Karen's walk to the cruiser was not crowded by jeers, only eyes, and the quiet felt like a verdict with manners. Shelley whispered that leadership is measured by exits as much as entrances. Karen stared at the hall's bones and had nothing left to borrow from her voice. Does silence repay a debt arrogance couldn't carry? Morales returned to Ethan the impounded copy of the bulldozer key and told him to hold it for evidence photos. And he set it on the seat with a care that said tools obey values here, not tempers. When power fits in a palm, who decides whether it becomes repair or ruin? Victor took one step closer, as if distance could force respect, and said Ethan had won a spectacle and lost a future. Ethan looked at the neighbors building a phone tree in minutes, at Tom recruiting volunteers, at Lila assigning statement slots by alphabet, at Marcus offering to haul scrap and bring a welder. Which future looked stronger, the one bought in rooms or the one built on the curb? Noah broke the moment with the detail that changed celebration into strategy. An automatic demolition review for Ethan's home had been filed overnight, scheduled at 8 a.m., shepherded by an acting deputy the records office could not verify, and the street's cheer thinned into steel. What good is a victory if the next blow lands at sunrise? Rosa read the letter twice, then pointed to a formatting tick she recognized from a retired template, and Morales' jaw set in that quiet way officers have when a line has been crossed too far and too often. How many alarms does a city need before it stops letting the same hands pull the same levers? Sergio said his team would hold watch through the night as witnesses, not muscle, and Tom handed out shifts like radios. Lila tapped out a message to parents for sworn statements in the morning. Shelley listed every fine to contest. Marcus promised coffee with the kind of smile people remember when they tell their kids where they were today. Is a neighborhood an army when it chooses to guard instead of harm? Victor checked his tablet and smirked at the countdown he believed couldn't be stopped, whispering that fatigue always wins by the fourth hour, and Ethan smiled back with the calm of a man who has rebuilt engines bolt by bolt under worse light. What is fatigue against a reason that doesn't sleep? The dust settled into a shape that looked a lot like relief, the kind you can hold without dropping, and Morales told the crowd the TRO request was already in motion, that the judge was reading, that the law can run when it needs to. Since when did hope sound this professional? Ethan walked to the rubble and pulled a strip from an old shop rag in his pocket, tied it to a bent nail like a small flag that said this land remembers who loved it, not who taxed it. Can a scrap of cloth weigh more than a ledger? Phones buzzed at once with a notification from the city portal. Hearing pending. 8 a.m. Temporary site access claimed by contractors working under Victor's umbrella, and every face turned from celebration to preparation without losing a step. How fast can joy become resolve when the stakes still breathe? Morales met Ethan's eyes and said they would be there at dawn. Noah pressed the spare flash drive into Ethan's hand with a promise it would upload if he didn't show. Lila squeezed Ethan's arm and told him her students were already writing about courage. Tom loaded his truck. Marcus picked up the chain. Rosa tucked the affidavits under her arm. Sergio counted heads and lifted his pen, because pens win the long wars, don't they? Victor walked back toward his convoy with that cool, thin smile that bets against ordinary people, and the neighborhood watched him go without fear, memorizing every license plate like homework you plan to ace. What happens to a machine when the smallest parts decide they're done turning the wrong way? Night would come, and with it, the clock. The 8 a.m. stamp waited like a dare. Ethan looked at his folder, at the key, at the rag on the nail, then at the faces that had chosen him as much as the fight, and the street understood the next scene belonged to them all. Who stands at the curb when the sun lifts and paper tries to pretend it is stronger than people? Dawn crept in on a street that refused to blink, and the 8 a.m. stamp sat in Ethan Cole's black folder like a dare with teeth, while neighbors lined the curb shoulder to shoulder, trading coffee, numbers, and a promise that no paper would outvote a home today. Who wakes up this early to lose on purpose? Marcus Reed strung caution ribbon from mailbox to mailbox, not to block the law, but to mark the line where lies keep tripping, and Lila Nguyen checked her list of sworn statements with the calm of someone who knows frightened children sleep better when adults stand tall. How many names does courage need before it starts sounding like a choir? Tom Briggs assigned posts with a nod and a nickname. Veterans of other battlegrounds smiling at the new recruits who thought resolve was a muscle you find only at the gym. And Sergio Alvarez logged every volunteer hour with the seriousness of a ledger that intends to testify. When witness work feels like defense, doesn't it begin to look like love? Rosa Calderon arrived with a stack of affidavits and a pen that never ran dry. And Noah Reyes set the timed upload to sunrise in case his phone went dark, while Ethan slid the folder under his arm and rested his palm on the bulldozer key like a handshake between will and restraint. Who needs speeches when hands already know their job? Engines rolled in with the precision of an unwelcome routine. Assessors in hard hats and clipboards fanned out under Victor Hale's thin smile. And Officer Dana Morales stepped forward to ask for orders, signatures, and the names of the people whose pens had swung at a family from across town. Which seal dares to show up after last night's lesson? The lead assessor flashed a badge engraved with a title Rosa recognized and a person she didn't, then produced a site access notice that called demolition a protective measure, and Morales read it twice before asking who defined protection and when. What kind of safety carries the same date as the threat it pretends to cure? Victor turned to Ethan with a number that would fix roofs and college funds in any other universe, then called it mercy and progress and necessary pain. And Ethan answered with a single tilt of the key that said some prices by nothing anyone here wants to own. Can a check repair a summer spent learning to turn a wrench beside a father's laughter? Grant Whitfield, pale and smaller than the clipboard he still clutched, shuffled toward Victor like gravity had changed direction, muttered about process and optics and a path to peace that didn't involve county lockup, and Victor dismissed him with the flick of a finger that cuts deeper than words. How long does a man serve a throne that never learned his name? Noah stepped to Morales with folder 4, the overlay vendor, the shell companies, the consultancy registered to Victor's brother, each arrow a string that tied Sunrise to a boardroom that never once heard a neighbor's doorbell. How far do plans travel when they only print maps and never meet the streets they redraw? Morales radioed the duty judge, voice clipped but steady, and Rosa filed a sworn statement memorializing the retired seal, while Sergio's team formed a clean human corridor between assessors and porches, badges forward, ink ready, and cameras already rolling. Is there a better alarm system than a community that knows how to document? The developer's aide lifted fencing posts and called it temporary, and Lila looked straight into the live stream and said temporary harm still counts as harm, then asked viewers to remember the names on the posts if they crossed without clearance. How many times can routine survive being seen? Financial Crimes crackled into Morales's ear to confirm the second drive's integrity and request copies of the access notice, and she announced it loudly enough that pens hesitated and clipboards shook. Can confidence ride its way through a street that finally learned how to read? Victor pivoted again, calling in a convoy of unmarked trucks he labeled contractors, promising a clean assessment before anyone could yawn, and Tom stepped into the lane with the easy weight of a man who has stood still in worse storms, asking which license numbers match the city's list. What happens when every shortcut is forced to spell its full name? Grant snapped at Ethan that a judge could still toss them all for obstruction, but Ethan nodded toward Morales and said the law was present and awake, then asked Grant whether he preferred to help or to be remembered for the last lie he carried. Which side saves a spine when the posture finally hurts? The duty judge returned the call with a temporary restraining order freezing all demolition or fencing until noon, and Morales read it line by line, while the crowd exhaled like brakes finally catching, though Victor's smile barely budged as he told his aide to keep the posts staged at the curb. When a man bets on fatigue, Does he notice the coffee in every hand? Rosa signed the affidavits. Lila gathered parents behind her. Marcus slipped the broken swing chain into his pocket like a vow. Noah pinged the stream with timestamps and links to filings. Sergio drew a neat box around the assessor's footprint and called it the witness zone. Since when did geometry feel like protection? Victor leaned in and whispered that even if Ethan kept the house, the bank would suffocate him with litigation. A bleed so slow it would look like paperwork. And Ethan smiled with that unshakable warmth grief sometimes carves into people who refuse to lose twice. How do you starve someone who learned to feed on purpose? Morales handed copies of the TRO to every clipboard in reach and asked each assessor to sign receipt. And two balked until Sergio read their badge numbers into his recorder, the sound of accountability tapping its foot. What tone does a pin make when it realizes it's part of the audio? Then the pivot none of them planned for arrived with a siren that did not belong to patrol cars. A city sedan rolled up carrying an interim director who actually existed, flanked by a council with the calm smile of people who prefer settlements to headlines. Which arrival scares bullies more, a camera or a colleague? The interim director scanned the TRO, the affidavits, Noah's map, Rosa's notes, and Victor's notice, then asked a single question about certified mail logs for the overlay. And his counsel's throat cleared with the kind of sound that introduces a mea culpa in professional clothing. Can a bureaucracy blush when it looks at a mirror? Victor straightened, ready to redirect. But the council admitted the logs were incomplete and a contractor had been retained off-list during an unusual winter session. And the street hummed with the quiet thrill of truth cracking its shell. How many winters can a scheme survive once the thermostat belongs to the neighbors? Grant looked at the asphalt and, for the first time, spoke like a citizen instead of a badge, confessing that the photo he waved yesterday belonged to another address because no engineer would sign what Victor wanted signed, and Karen's voice from the cruiser tried to twist his confession into betrayal. Whose forgiveness weighs more, the crowd's or the boss's? Morales nodded once. The investigator took statements, and the interim director ordered the assessors to stand down pending a noon hearing. But Victor stepped forward through his own retreat and delivered the last poison he had. An internal memo recommending a blight designation for Ethan's block to accelerate acquisition, who writes blight over people and expects them to thank the pen. Noah's thumb hovered, then pressed send on the sunrise upload, and thousands of eyes lit up as the memo hit public screens with the names still visible. And Lila whispered to the stream that this is what theft looks like when it learns grammar. How do you unsee a signature that tried to erase where children sleep? The interim director turned to Victor, counsel whispering hard now, and asked for the author of the memo. Victor smiled the way a mask smiles when it hears a zipper, and he said the author would be happy to discuss it at noon. Can you hear arrogance tapping the mic before the stagehands cut power? Ethan stepped onto the bulldozer, not to move, but to be seen by the neighbors who had earned the right to look at him without fear. And he raised the key like a promise that stayed inside its boundary. Where does strength land when it's taught by grief to be gentle? Morales folded the TRO and told the crowd the next fight would be a courtroom one, that the street had done its job by surviving the morning without surrender, and Sergio dismissed the witness line with a softness that felt like victory passing into vigilance. Isn't the hardest part after the storm deciding what to rebuild first? Victor retreated to his SUV, made one last call, and his smile returned as if the voice on the other end had reminded him where levers are hidden, and a courier hustled up with a slim envelope bearing a seal none of them recognized. Which seal tries to enter a town that just learned how to check? Noah took the envelope, weighed it with a frown, and handed it to Morales as Ethan climbed down to stand beside Rosa, Lila, Marcus, and Tom, the ordinary heroes of a block that upgraded itself in one night. And Morales slid a finger under the flap to reveal a judge's name from a neighboring district and an order claiming jurisdiction at 11 on grounds of regional interest. Which bench believes it can reach across a street that finally knows its own address? The neighboring order hit Officer Dana Morales's hands like a stone thrown from across a river, and Rosa Calderon read the seal once, then twice, then said the bench had no reach here without notice or consent. Which court forgets the map when the street finally knows its own name? Victor Hale leaned on the SUV with that thin smile that likes to show up right before people give up, and Ethan Cole stepped forward with the black folder, and said quiet enough to be heard that jurisdiction matters because people matter, and the interim director nodded to counsel, who called the local duty judge on speaker while the live stream counted up by the hundred. When a crowd becomes a gallery, who still performs for shadows? The duty judge's voice returned calm and clipped, staying the out-of-district order and affirming the restraining order already in place. And Morales announced it to the line like a drumbeat: site access denied, fencing prohibited, demolition frozen, and two assessors lowered their clipboards as if the weight had finally been measured in hands instead of ink. How heavy is a signature once it loses the lie that carried it? Grant Whitfield took a single breath that sounded like surrender finding dignity, then walked to Morales and offered a written statement naming the off-list contractor. In the meeting, where Victor promised favors for speed, and Karen Whitfield shouted from the cruiser that he was weak, but Shelley Park answered that honesty looks like strength from here. When a marriage to power ends, what vows remain? Noah Reyes watched the sunrise upload finish and pressed record again, addressing the stream like students on test day. This is what due process looks like when neighbors read their own homework, and Lila Nguyen added a list of families willing to swear to fees weaponized as leverage. Can testimony become a shield before lunch? Victor tried charm with the interim director one last time, a velvet path back to comfort. But the director asked for logs Victor could not produce, and counsel quietly requested he remain until investigators arrived. And the aide holding fencing posts set them down with the care of someone putting away a mistake. Isn't retreat just gravity in a different suit? The first unmarked sedan rolled up with financial crimes, and an investigator took Noah's flash drive, Rose's affidavits, and Victor's folder in a single practice sweep, then asked Victor whether he wanted to correct the mailing addresses listed to a street that doesn't exist. How far can confidence travel on imaginary roads? Victor's smile cracked just enough to show the jaw beneath as he said counsel would clarify at noon, and the investigator replied that clarifications read better under oath, while Morales read badge numbers into her mic with the patience of a clock that has run out of excuses to be late. What time is it when accountability stops asking? Ethan climbed onto the bulldozer and sat without turning the key, hands easy on his knees, and Marcus Reed moved to his side with the broken swing chain like a promise in metal, while Tom Briggs posted volunteers at each corner in pairs. Sergio Alvarez dismissed his team to the witness zone, but stayed himself at the center line. Which man leaves when leaving is the only mistake left. A city courier appeared again, breathless, with a final envelope addressed to the interim director from the zoning board, recommending blight designation based on public safety concerns, and Noah laughed once, not cruel, just done, then held up the stream showing the intact front yards of families who mow their own grass and fix their own porches. What does blight mean when the only thing broken is integrity? The interim director signed a pause memo on the spot, suspending any blight discussions pending investigation, and the cheer that followed was the soft kind, relief choosing to be careful, while Lila whispered that her class would write letters to the council about how words can be used to erase or to build, which vocabulary belongs to a city that remembers its people. Detectives stepped to Victor, asked him to place his hands where they could see, and informed him of seizure warrants for devices tied to the holding company chain. And he tried that old line about cooperation as choice, but the cuff spoke first, a quiet click that sounded like punctuation at last. How many chapters end with the same period? Karen watched the cuffs close on the man she believed would rewrite her ending and finally understood that some mirrors only return what you gave them. And Shelley, eyes wet but steady, told her the neighborhood would fix the swings and the budgets and the habit of confusing leadership with control. Can a fall become a lesson bigger than the person who fell? Grant handed Morales his clipboard, empty now except for a pen, and said he would help repair what he helped break. Tom gave him a shift, because redemption has paperwork too, and Marcus shook his hand once, firm, letting the street decide a new verdict for a man who stopped lying. What does justice look like when it learns to welcome repentance? The interim director faced the crowd and dissolved the HOA board's authority pending audit, appointing an interim community committee by emergency rule with open sessions and recorded votes, and Noah read the names without grandstanding. Neighbors who showed up at dawn now asked to show up with agendas and calendars. When power moves next door, who keeps the porch light on? Ethan stepped down from the bulldozer and opened the black folder, sliding the 8 a.m. paper under the photo of the motorcycle like stacking threats beneath memory, then pressed the spare key into Noah's palm. Keep it safe until the garage rises, and Noah nodded like a promise being installed. What is inheritance if not the tools you trust another to carry? Sergio announced the witness log closed and returned his pen to his chest pocket, saying the street owns its story now, and Rosa began scheduling a training night on notices, seals, and appeals, while Lila drafted a flyer for a workshop called How to Read a Threat. Can literacy be a neighborhood watch? Morales handed Ethan a copy of the TRO with her card attached, saying call if anyone so much as breathes wrong near your line. And her tone carried a warmth that belongs to guardians who have seen enough, who protects the protectors when a city remembers what the badge is for. The tow trucks rolled out with Victor's SUVs, the convoy shrinking in the mirrors, and the comment counter kept rising as other neighborhoods asked the same question. How did you win? And Ethan answered without talking, organizing tables where the hall had stood, stacking bottled water, blank forms, cheap pens, and purpose. Is there a stronger victory than teaching the next block? Marcus lifted his kid onto the bulldozer seat for a second, and the child grinned like engines make sense when they're used for right. And Tom unfolded a folding chair like he was pitching a headquarters on a sidewalk, while Shelley pulled a tiny cloth triangle from an old work rag and tied it to the bent nail Ethan had planted, whose flag is small enough to fit in a pocket and big enough to claim a future. The detectives led Victor past the neighbors without spectacle, only gravity, and he kept his eyes forward because even men who buy cities know when not to look at the people who didn't sell. And Karen's cruiser turned toward County, her white suit no longer a symbol of power but a reminder of how fragile costumes are in rain. How long does fabric hold a story it was never meant to carry? Ethan looked at the faces around him and finally let breath leave his chest the way truth leaves a ledger once it is read. And he said what mattered and only what mattered. The garage will rise, not by one pair of hands, but by every pair that wants it. And the chorus answered, we're here without rehearsal. Can a promise be binding when everyone signs with presence? Phones buzzed again, a message from across town. An HOA with the same vendor list and the same winter overlay. And Noah met Ethan's eyes with a question that didn't need words. Lila lifted her clipboard. Tom checked his fuel. Marcus nodded toward the truck. Rosa tucked more forms into her bag. Sergio smiled like a man who enjoys the right kind of work. When justice learns to travel, who opens the door? Ethan placed the bulldozer key back on the seat, not as a threat, as a reminder that strength belongs to whoever steers it with care, then picked up the black folder and the little cloth flag and walked toward the curb, the place where fights begin and communities are measured. If the next street calls, will this one answer with the same steady yes? The stream ended on the sound of neighbors laughing, the tired laugh of survivors who planned to build. And the last frame held the key, the rag, the folder, and the faces, all ordinary, all unstoppable. And the final question hung there like fresh paint drying on a door ready to open again. When power forgets people, are you ready to remind it who owns the ground?